The music industry doesn't just sell songs, it sells access to fame, to a lifestyle most people can't imagine. And for decades, that access came with drugs baked into the culture, backstage, and on every tour bus. These 12 R&B legends didn't choose addiction. It was fed to them by an industry that offered almost no support when things fell apart. Some survived and rebuilt, others didn't make it out. This isn't about judging them, it's about understanding what really happened behind the music we still love.
Measure for measure.
1. Whitney Houston.
And the sun begins to fade.
Whitney Houston had, by nearly every measure, the greatest voice of her generation. Trained in gospel, mentored by Aretha Franklin's family, she debuted in 1985 with a run of hits that made her the most decorated female artist in music history. I Want to Dance with Somebody wasn't just a hit. It was joy distilled into 3.5 minutes, a song that still fills dance floors today. By the mid-90s, that joy had curdled into something much darker. Whitney's marriage to Bobby Brown coincided with escalating cocaine use that she later admitted, in a widely discussed interview with Diane Sawyer, had become a daily habit hidden from almost everyone around her, including at times her own family. Her once flawless voice began cracking in live performances. Tabloids mocked. What they didn't understand was a documented substance use disorder unfolding in full public view. Whitney attempted rehab multiple times over the following decade, and there were genuine periods of hope, including a comeback album in 2009 that sold well but revealed a voice permanently changed by years of abuse and heavy smoking. Friends and family described watching someone they loved disappear in stages long before the final moment came. On February 11, 2012, Whitney was found unresponsive in a hotel bathtub in Beverly Hills the night before the Grammy Awards. The coroner's report listed drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use as contributing factors. She was 48 years old. The tragedy wasn't just her death. It was watching the industry profit from her decline for nearly 2 decades before it finally happened. 2. Rick James. Rick James built his entire persona around excess, and for a while, it made him one of the biggest stars in funk music.
She's a very kinky girl.
Super Freak turned him into a household name in 1981, a song so infectious and instantly recognizable that it later became the sampled backbone of MC Hammer's You Can't Touch This, introducing James's sound to an entirely new generation, nearly a decade later.
When I make my move to her room, it's the right time.
James was proud, brash, and unapologetically wild on stage, but behind that carefully cultivated persona was a genuine cocaine addiction that consumed millions of dollars in earnings and eventually his freedom entirely.
She's a super freak.
Bandmates and collaborators described a man who blurred the line between performance and reality, living the excess he sang about rather than simply portraying it.
From her head down to her toenails.
In 1991, James was convicted of assault and false imprisonment connected to drug-fueled incidents involving a woman he'd brought back to his home, spending over 2 years in California State Prison. It was a devastating fall for someone who had once headlined arenas.
Ricky sing. Blow, Danny.
After his release, James got clean and spent his final years speaking candidly to younger artists about exactly the trap he'd fallen into, warning them the industry wouldn't save them from themselves.
She's not a crowd to her, she says.
On August 6, 2004, Rick James was found dead at his home in Los Angeles. The coroner determined the cause was a combination of 9 different drugs found in his system, including cocaine and methamphetamine, alongside underlying heart disease that years of substance abuse had worsened.
Those hands together. Let's turn the music war.
He was 56 years old. Rick James never really hid his addiction. He performed it night after night, and the industry sold tickets to watch. 3. Etta James. Etta James recorded At Last in 1960, a song so tender and full of longing that it's become the default choice for first dances at weddings ever since. Sung at countless ceremonies by people who have no idea what the woman behind that voice was actually living through.
Come along.
By the time she recorded it, Etta was already using heroin, a habit she'd picked up as a teenager, growing up largely without stable parental guidance in Los Angeles.
At last.
Etta's addiction spanned decades and cost her nearly everything at different points along the way. Her freedom when she was arrested in the 70s for forging prescriptions to feed her habit. Her career momentum during long stretches when she was too unwell or unreliable to record or tour consistently. And almost her life, more than once, from overdoses she was fortunate enough to survive when many of her contemporaries didn't.
The skies above.
What made Etta different from many artists of her era was her honesty. In her 1995 memoir, Rage to Survive, she detailed her addiction in unflinching, often brutal terms, refusing to let the industry's culture of silence around Black women's substance abuse define or sanitize her story the way it had for others. She entered the Betty Ford Center in the mid-'80s and achieved lasting sobriety, rebuilding a respected career, singing blues and jazz for the rest of her life, earning a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award along the way.
I looked at you.
Etta James died from complications of leukemia and dementia in January 2012 at age 73. Etta didn't just survive addiction, she made absolutely sure people talked about it honestly, on her own terms. 4. David Ruffin. David Ruffin's voice on My Girl is one of the most recognized in Motown history, gritty, aching, and unmistakable from the very first line. As lead singer of The Temptations from 1964 to 1968, Ruffin helped define an entire era of soul music, carrying the group through some of its biggest commercial and creative peaks. But Ruffin's cocaine use grew increasingly disruptive, marked by missed rehearsals, unpredictable behavior, and growing tension with his bandmates, until Motown made the difficult decision to fire him from the very group he'd helped make famous. It was a decision that devastated Ruffin both personally and professionally, and he never quite found the same level of success again, despite a genuinely talented voice. Ruffin spent the rest of his career chasing the success he'd had with The Temptations, occasionally reuniting with former groupmates for tours and recordings. But he could never fully escape the addiction that had cost him his position in the first place. His personal relationships were reportedly turbulent throughout this period. He was previously romantically connected to Tammy Terrell, whose own tragic story involved alleged abuse before her death from a brain tumor at just 24. On June 1, 1991, David Ruffin died of a cocaine overdose in a Philadelphia hospital after collapsing outside a known crack house in the city. He was 50 years old, in a heartbreaking footnote. Thousands of mourners showed up at his funeral to honor a voice that had shaped the sound of Motown, even as the disease that ultimately killed him remained largely unspoken in the public eulogies that followed. Listen, 90% of you watching these videos right now ain't subscribed yet. If these stories are blowing your mind, imagine what you're missing. Hit subscribe, turn on that bell, and join the R&B fans who never miss a Groove Lens upload. 5. Bobby Womack. Bobby Womack wrote and performed Across 110th Street for the 1972 blaxploitation film of the same name, a gritty, soul-drenched track about survival and desperation in Harlem that later found new life soundtracking Quentin Tarantino's Jackie Brown a quarter century afterward. Womack knew that world of struggle intimately, not from the streets of Harlem specifically, but from a decades-long personal battle with cocaine addiction that nearly ended his career multiple separate times. Womack's addiction ran parallel to an almost unbearable string of personal tragedies. His brother Harry was murdered in 1974, stabbed to death by a girlfriend, and his infant son Jordan died of sudden infant death syndrome in 1978. Womack has spoken openly in later interviews about self-medicating through both losses, spiraling deeper into addiction through the 80s, even as he continued quietly writing hit songs for other artists behind the scenes. Womack eventually got clean and experienced a genuine career resurgence in his later years, most notably collaborating with Gorillaz and producer Damon Albarn on the acclaimed album The Bravest Man in the Universe in 2012, introducing his voice to an entirely new generation of listeners. It was a remarkable and unlikely third act for an artist many had written off. He died on June 27, 2014 at 70 years old from complications related to Parkinson's disease and other serious health issues that stemmed directly from decades of substance abuse on his body. Bobby Womack's story is a powerful reminder that addiction rarely happens in isolation. Very often, it's grief wearing a different, more destructive mask. 6. Sly Stone. Sly Stone wrote Everyday People as an anthem of unity and inclusion in 1968, a song so genuinely optimistic that it coined the now famous phrase, "different strokes for different folks." It's difficult to reconcile that hopeful, community-minded message with what came next in Sly's own life, one of the most severe and prolonged addiction stories in modern music history. By the early 70s, Sly's cocaine and PCP use had become so extreme and unpredictable that he frequently missed shows entirely, sometimes failing to appear for scheduled concerts without explanation, badly damaging his professional reputation and gradually unraveling the very band that had once defined an entire genre of music. Sly Stone spent decades largely out of the public eye afterward, at various points reportedly living out of a van in Los Angeles, his once massive fortune from record sales and touring almost entirely gone. Unlike many others on this list, Sly Stone survived, and remarkably, he's still alive as of this recording. He has spoken publicly and candidly about his decades-long recovery journey in more recent years, releasing a detailed memoir in 2023 titled "Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself Again," that laid out the full extent of his addiction for the first time in his own words. His story isn't ultimately a tragedy of death, the way so many others on this list are. It's a tragedy of nearly 50 years lost to a disease that the industry surrounding him did almost nothing to address until it was nearly, but not quite, too late. 7. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye's voice on Let's Get It On in 1973 helped redefine soul music as something sensual, personal, and unmistakably adult, moving the genre in a new direction entirely. But by the late 70s and into the early 80s, Marvin was deep into a cocaine addiction that intertwined dangerously with severe depression, growing paranoia, and financial ruin stemming from a brutal, expensive divorce settlement with his first wife, Anna Gordy. Marvin actually moved to Ostend, Belgium at one point, simply to physically escape the drug culture and industry pressures surrounding him back in Los Angeles. A genuine self-imposed exile that helped him achieve enough sobriety and clarity to record his critically acclaimed comeback album, Midnight Love, which featured the massive hit Sexual Healing and revived his career almost overnight. But the peace he'd found in Belgium didn't last once he returned home. Marvin moved back in with his aging parents in Los Angeles, and his relationship with his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., was volatile, and according to multiple family accounts given after the fact, worsened significantly by ongoing drug use on both sides of that relationship, along with old, unresolved family tensions. On April 1st, 1984, one day before his 45th birthday, a heated argument between Marvin and his father spiraled completely out of control and turned fatal, ending with his father shooting him twice during the confrontation at their family home. Marvin's addiction didn't kill him directly in the end, but the instability and volatility it helped create around him never fully cleared, right up until that final, devastating morning. 8. James Brown. James Brown, the self-proclaimed godfather of soul, built a legendary multi-decade career on discipline and control, famously fining his own band members on the spot for missed notes, scuffed shoes, or any perceived lapse in showmanship. But that same relentless intensity fed a serious PCP addiction that surfaced publicly and dramatically in 1988, when Brown led police on a highway chase spanning 2 states after bursting into an insurance seminar in Augusta, Georgia, armed with a shotgun, reportedly while under the influence. Brown was sentenced to 6 years in prison for that incident and related charges, of which he ultimately served roughly 2 years before being paroled, and he continued to have documented struggles with drugs and separate domestic violence allegations for years afterward, well into his later career. These incidents were widely reported at the time, but are often quietly left out of glowing musical retrospectives today. Even so, Brown kept performing well into his 70s, refusing to let his addiction and legal troubles fully derail the enormous legacy he'd spent decades building as one of the most influential performers in American music history, a man whose grooves shaped funk, soul, and eventually hip-hop itself. James Brown died on December 25, 2006, at age 73, from congestive heart failure. His story sits at a genuinely uncomfortable intersection. A legitimate musical genius whose addiction and volatility caused real, documented harm to real people around him. A complexity that a lot of glossy tribute retrospectives conveniently choose to leave out entirely. 9. Phyllis Hyman. Phyllis Hyman had a voice built for jazz clubs and Broadway stages, a rich, powerful contralto that made You Know How to Love Me a dance floor staple and Quiet Storm radio favorite in 1979, showcasing a technical vocal ability that critics consistently praised throughout her career. She would go on to earn a Tony nomination for her work in the Broadway musical Sophisticated Ladies, further proof of her enormous range as a performer. But Phyllis privately battled undiagnosed bipolar disorder for years, self-medicating with alcohol and prescription medications as she struggled to access consistent, appropriate mental health treatment in a music industry that had almost no meaningful framework for supporting artists with these kinds of conditions at the time. Her substance use gradually worsened alongside deep career frustrations, as Phyllis increasingly felt she never received the mainstream recognition and crossover success her talent genuinely deserved, watching less vocally gifted contemporaries surpass her commercially again and again. On June 30th, 1995, just hours before she was scheduled to perform at the historic Apollo Theater in Harlem, Phyllis died by suicide from an intentional overdose of barbiturates combined with alcohol at her Manhattan apartment. She left behind notes referencing her ongoing struggles. She was 45 years old. Her death remains a difficult and important reminder that substance abuse and mental illness are very often inseparable from one another, and that Phyllis needed consistent, compassionate treatment that the industry surrounding her simply wasn't equipped or willing to provide during her lifetime. 10. Natalie Cole. Natalie Cole spent years trying to step out from underneath her father, Nat King Cole's enormous musical shadow, and this will be, in 1975, finally proved decisively that she could succeed entirely on her own terms, earning her the Grammy Award for Best New Artist that year, and establishing her as a genuine star in her own right, not just a famous name. But fame arrived alongside heavy heroin and cocaine use that Natalie later openly described as an attempt to cope with the immense pressure of living up to her father's towering legacy, combined with the disorienting speed of her own rapid rise to stardom. Natalie's addiction became public and severe enough that she checked into rehabilitation programs multiple times throughout the late 70s and 80s, and at one particularly low point, she nearly lost custody of her young son as a direct result of her ongoing substance abuse. She achieved a celebrated, well-documented recovery and later a remarkable career resurgence, most famously with her 1991 album, Unforgettable with Love, a tribute project that paired her own voice, through studio technology, with her late father's original recordings, becoming a massive commercial and critical success that reintroduced her to an entirely new audience. But the toll of her earlier addiction lingered quietly in her health for the rest of her life. Natalie contracted hepatitis C, which she directly attributed to drug use during those difficult years, ultimately requiring a kidney transplant in 2009 to survive. She died on December 31, 2015, at 65 years old, from complications related to that long-term illness. Natalie's recovery was completely real, but so were the physical consequences that quietly outlasted it. 11. Esther Phillips. Esther Phillips was a genuine musical prodigy, discovered as Little Esther at just 14 years old, singing on the Los Angeles amateur talent circuit before scoring her first R&B chart hits by the age of 15, an almost unheard of level of early success in that era. But the very same teenage years that launched her unlikely career also introduced her to heroin, beginning a serious addiction that would come to define and repeatedly derail her career for the next 2 full decades.
Give me your heart.
By her 20s, Esther's addiction had made her nearly unemployable within the industry, and she disappeared from the public spotlight for long, difficult stretches at a time, missing out on opportunities that might have gone to other, more reliable performers.
Just say goodbye.
Her 1972 recording of Gil Scott-Heron's devastating song, Home is Where the Hatred Is, a track dealing directly and unflinchingly with addiction and its toll on Black communities, wasn't really a metaphor for Esther personally.
Please stop pretending.
It was much closer to pure autobiography, and critics recognized that raw, lived-in honesty immediately, earning her a well-deserved Grammy nomination that year. She achieved genuine periods of sobriety and career revival throughout the 70s, touring and recording steadily and rebuilding some of the trust and momentum she'd lost.
And just say goodbye.
But the cumulative physical damage from nearly 2 decades of addiction had already been done to her body by that point, regardless of her later efforts at recovery.
I can't forget how soft your voice was when you told me.
Esther Phillips died on August 7, 1984, at just 48 years old, from liver and kidney failure. Very few singers in music history have ever sung their own addiction with quite that much unflinching, painful honesty.
And when you begged me for my love, I thought it might.
12. Chaka Khan. Chaka Khan's voice on I'm Every Woman in 1978 radiated confidence, strength, and power from the very first note, a song that became a genuine feminist anthem and was later covered to massive success by Whitney Houston herself, introducing it to an entirely new generation of listeners. Behind that powerful, commanding public image, however, Chaka has been remarkably candid in later interviews and in her own memoir about a cocaine addiction that spanned much of the 70s and 80s, driven in large part by the genuinely exhausting demands of touring relentlessly with the band Ruffin, and then later maintaining an equally demanding solo career on top of that. Unlike many of the other artists featured in this video, Chaka's story is ultimately one of survival and hard-won honesty rather than tragedy. She's spoken openly and repeatedly about entering rehabilitation in the 1990s and has continued to actively advocate for addiction awareness in the many decades since, including founding the Chaka Khan Foundation, a charitable organization focused specifically on supporting at-risk youth and families affected by substance abuse issues. Now in her 70s, Chaka Khan remains genuinely active in music, one of the rare surviving voices from this particular era of the industry, who lived long enough to transform her own addiction story into meaningful advocacy work, rather than becoming another cautionary tale. Her survival certainly doesn't erase what addiction ultimately cost her, including years of career instability and damaged personal relationships along the way. But it does offer something none of the other stories on this list quite could: real, living proof that recovery is genuinely possible, even after everything this era of the industry put its brightest stars through. 12 voices, 12 legends, and a pattern that repeats across decades. An industry that profited from artists at their most vulnerable, offering almost no support when things fell apart. Some, like Chaka Khan and Etta James, found recovery and spoke about it honestly. Others never got the chance to tell their own story. Behind every legendary voice was a real person carrying more weight than the audience ever saw. If this hit you the way it hit me, hit subscribe. We're telling more of these untold music stories every week, and you won't want to miss the next one.